The morning heat already pressed down on Dusktown Reserve Base by the time Keira wiped her hands on a rag that used to be white. The air was thick with the mingled scent of burnt rubber, sun-scorched paint, and motor oil. She crouched beneath the M2 Bradley's side panel, one gloved hand resting lightly on the access latch while the other adjusted the torque setting on her wrench. The tool clicked with precision. Like a language she spoke fluently, but never out loud. Keira didn't hurry. She never did. Each step mattered. Every bolt held weight. She worked with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned that visibility often cost more than it offered. Inside the hangar, the old fans spun lazy circles, kicking up the grit that coated every surface in a thin, beige film. Miles moved quietly nearby, sorting the day's parts delivery. He was newer, younger, still figuring out which silences meant safety and which ones meant danger. Keira had figured that out a long time ago. She wore her silence like armor. Then came the sound of boots, sharp, confident, louder than necessary. Ray strode in with the kind of posture that assumed ownership of any space he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a commander's insignia stitched crisply above his chest pocket. He had the presence of someone who'd never had to explain himself. Behind him trailed Lance, smirking already, and two other soldiers in standard camo. Jonas, the maintenance lead, hustled over with a clipboard in hand, his steps lighter but quicker, a little too eager. Ray's eyes scanned the hangar and landed on the Bradley. Then they landed on Keira. "You've got civilians on inspection work now." His voice cut across the space like a blade. He turned to Jonas without waiting for an answer. "I asked for someone qualified. I didn't realize you were outsourcing to the support staff." Keira didn't look up. She finished the final turn of the wrench, rechecked the torque mark, then stood and set the tool gently on the cart beside her. She could feel the silence behind her, the kind that tightens around a room, the kind that checks who will speak up and who will not. Jonas cleared his throat. "She's on the schedule for diagnostics, sir. Routine workup before the readiness log." Ray cocked his head, expression dripping with false curiosity. "Diagnostics? That's cute. What's her name again?" No one answered. Not Jonas. Not Lance. Not even Miles, who now pretended to be deeply focused on the parts bin. Keira brushed a strand of dust-matted hair from her cheek. "There's a slight torque imbalance in the pressure sink manifold," she said quietly. "I logged it this morning. Might want to run a real-time reading at incline load. It won't show static." Ray raised an eyebrow as if she'd spoken a different language. "You found a problem the onboard didn't." "Not a problem," she said, still calm. "Adrift. Happens just before the R6 patch triggers a bypass. You won't notice until slope angle passes 100.0 degrees per second lateral." Lance chuckled. "Sounds like someone's been reading repair forums again." Keira met his eyes briefly, then looked away. The silence deepened. Ray tilted his head. "So let me get this straight. You, standing here in oil-stained coveralls, think you know more about this Bradley's response system than the R6 firmware. You telling me that?" Keira didn't flinch. "No. I'm saying the R6 masks the drift, doesn't stop it, and if you're pulling throttle uphill with a full squad inside, you'll feel it." Lance barked out a laugh. "Let's hope she's not driving when it happens." Jonas laughed too, but it was brittle, forced. "All right," he said quickly. "Let's just move along. Ray, I'll have Lance and I handle the checklist from here. Keira, you're good to move on to the battery rack." That was it. Not a correction, not a defense, just an offhand dismissal, smooth and practiced. Keira picked up her wrench. No one made eye contact. Miles opened his mouth like he might say something, then looked back down at his clipboard instead. Ray clapped Lance on the back. "Glad we've got actual techs on this now. Hate to see a $1 million ride go belly up because someone wanted to play mechanic." Keira stepped back. She said nothing else. The wrench in her hand felt heavier than before. Not with weight, but with the kind of certainty that comes when you realize, once again, that being right doesn't matter. Not here. Not yet. She walked past the diagnostic bench and returned the tool to her personal kit. The torque calibration she had run would remain untouched, unsigned, unseen. Just another adjustment nobody cared to ask about. Another correction erased before it could even be tested. Outside the hangar, the heat shimmered across the tarmac. A gull turned lazy circles above the comms tower. Keira stopped in the shadow of the bay door and leaned one shoulder against the frame, watching the sun stretch over the Bradley's hull. She didn't look back. No one called her name. Keira didn't head for the break room like she usually did after morning inspection. Instead, she walked to the back corner of the garage, where the older lockers stood in the shade of a broken overhead light. The metal door squealed slightly as she pulled it open. Inside, beneath a rolled sweatshirt and a battered thermos, sat her personal kit. Not the station-issued tools, but the ones she had brought with her 5 years ago when she stepped off the bus in Dusktown. Tools that cost more than her last 2 paychecks combined. Tools she hadn't used in public in a very long time. She lifted the case from its shelf and carried it to her workbench. The latches popped open with a satisfying click. Inside, everything gleamed. The wrenches were titanium alloy with grip-textured handles, laser-etched to eliminate glare under floodlights. Her torque read in decimals, accurate to within 1/1000th of a pound. The cable testers were triple insulated, color-coded, and still smelled faintly of cedar from the box they had once been stored in. Every piece fit into a foam mold, like it belonged in a museum, not a garage that reeked of axle grease and dust. She ran her fingers over the curved neck of her calibration driver, not to use it yet, but just to remember. Her hands moved with unconscious rhythm. The weight, the balance, the texture of each tool was a language she still spoke fluently, even if no one around her understood it anymore. At the bottom of the case was a folded sheet of paper, dog-eared and yellowed at the edges. Keira unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing, hand-sketched in pencil with annotations in her father's handwriting. A suspension rig, early Bradley prototype drawn from memory after one of his field visits. She had been 17 when they made it together. He'd let her trace the axis lines, label the parts. The torque vector calculations in the margins were hers. The smile on his face in the photo pinned to the corner was the kind that didn't fade, even after he did. She pressed the paper flat against the workbench and stared at the lines. The pressure sink imbalance had shown up before, years ago. It had a pattern, not a flaw in hardware, but in how torque redistribution lagged under elevation shift. She had built a fix for it then, a field mod. Not a software patch like the R6, but a physical sync override manual. Mechanical. Effective. Her old team had dismissed it as too analog, too slow, too expensive to retrofit. So she built it anyway. And when the lawsuit came, and the non-disclosure agreement wiped her name off every file she had touched, she packed her kit and her silence and left. That evening, long after the others had gone, Keira sat at the same bench with the drawing in front of her and a folded napkin under her elbow. A clean one. She was sketching again curve paths, input lag ratios, spring resistance arcs. Her pencil moved quickly but precisely, looping down through numbers she hadn't had to look up in years. The shape was still in her head, still in her hands. Miles wandered in, carrying a stack of filters. He paused when he saw her, hesitated, then stepped closer. "You draw that from memory?" he asked, nodding at the napkin. Keira didn't look up. "It's just a layout. Looks more like a correction." She kept her voice neutral. "Just an idea." Miles stepped a little closer, studying the napkin. "You ever think about submitting something like that? Like, officially?" "I've submitted enough things for a lifetime." He didn't push. He looked at the tools, the drawing, the lines she'd sketched. That torque drift thing from this morning. "How'd you know?" She stopped drawing. "I heard it." "Heard it." She nodded. "It's not a sound the system flags, it's a rhythm. You hear it just before the lateral roll kicks out." Miles looked impressed. I didn't even know that was possible. She finally met his eyes. Most people don't listen long enough. That night, when the garage was dark except for the exit sign and the soft glow of one workstation lamp, Keira opened the storage cabinet at the back of the bay and pulled down an old test bracket. She wiped it clean, bolted it to her table, and began assembling the override system piece by piece. She didn't need diagrams. She built it from memory, fingers moving with that same slow certainty she used on torque settings. Each part clicked into place like a secret being remembered. The tension spring, the throttle diverter, the modified sync loop, not factory parts, but adjusted, shaved, calibrated, rethreaded by hand. They would never pass inspection in a formal shop, but they would work. She finished just past midnight. The override module lay on the table, no bigger than a lunchbox, connected to the bracket with a series of dampened clamps and a bypass controller she had rebuilt from scrap. She tested the tension once. It held. She tested it again. Still smooth. Keira didn't smile, but her breathing slowed, not with exhaustion, with recognition. She didn't write her name on it. She didn't need to. The hangar was quiet. Shadows stretched across the walls, broken only by the slanted light of the desk lamp and the faint, rising heat from the floor. Outside, the wind shifted through the empty loading bay. A dull clatter echoed somewhere far off. Another wrench dropped. Another job done. Keira turned off the lamp and stood. The module remained on the table. Quiet. Unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. But she did. Some tools weren't for sharing. Some truths weren't for telling. Not until someone needed them. The first sign came halfway up the east slope. Ray had driven that incline a dozen times before, but this time the Bradley's throttle lagged for less than a second, just enough to send a ripple through the onboard monitors. Then came the drift. Subtle but undeniable, an uneven lateral response when the treads adjusted to the off-camber terrain. The vehicle corrected itself, but not before the rear shifted just wide enough to knock two rear gunners sideways in their seats. Back in the garage, Lance shrugged off the report as elevation distortion. "Dry grit buildup," he said as he keyed in the override on the control pad. "Happens every time the forecast swings more than 10 degrees. Ray didn't look convinced, but he let it pass. Lance ran the R6 hot loop patch like he always did. He leaned over the diagnostic board with the confidence of someone who believed any fix that fit on a screen was the right one. By midday, the Bradley had lost nearly 1/3 of its slope stability during test turns. The left side response lagged by almost 2 seconds on incline, which wouldn't mean much if the vehicle were only patrolling flat terrain. But Ray's unit wasn't headed for flat ground. Jonas paced the garage with the checklist sheet rolled in one hand, sweat gathering along his temples. He was trying not to panic, but his eyes flicked constantly toward the open hangar doors, where brass from higher up were scheduled to walk through that afternoon. The rehearsal operation was set for the end of the week, and if Ray's unit missed that window, the command structure would start asking questions Jonas didn't want to answer. "They just need to recalibrate," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't a failure, this is noise." In the far corner, Keira sat at her bench. She was tightening a test bracket when the silence shifted. The kind of silence that followed someone important walking into a room. The man was lean, maybe mid-40s, in a gray Pentagon jacket with a plain black duffel slung over one shoulder. He didn't wear a name tag. Didn't need one. His posture and expression made it clear that he wasn't there for a tour. He walked straight to Jonas, who straightened with a nervous smile. "Can I help you, sir?" The man pulled out a tablet and tapped something quickly. "Name's Tanner. I'm here on request from Command Logistics. Vehicle integrity assessments tied to readiness failures. Bradley number 427, assigned to Lieutenant Ray." Jonas blanched. "It's not a failure, sir. Just some drift we're already addressing." Tanner didn't reply. He handed Jonas a data sheet. "This one's been patched 6 times in 2 weeks. R6 firmware is designed to mask torque instability, not correct it. That's a problem." Jonas faltered. "We've got our best people on it." "Do you?" Tanner asked without raising his voice. "Because your logs say otherwise." He moved past Jonas and walked to the data terminal. He inserted a key drive and pulled up the full maintenance log on the overhead display. The scroll began, and dozens of lines of diagnostics filled the screen. Tanner narrowed his eyes. He wasn't looking for general wear or predictable faults. He was looking for signatures, design imprints, the fingerprints of whoever last touched the manifold spec. When he paused, it was only for a moment. "Who's Keira?" he asked, not turning around. No one answered. Lance scratched his head. Jonas shifted his weight. Miles glanced up from a nearby bin but stayed quiet. Tanner turned. His eyes found Keira across the room. "That you?" She didn't nod. She just set down her tool and wiped her hands on a cloth. "Your name's on the mod archive for the original torque sync pathway. This was yours." Tanner's voice was calm, but it left little room for evasion. Keira didn't move. "I worked on sync stabilization once," she said, "a long time ago. That override method you flagged in the logs, why not recommend it?" She stared at the screen, not at him. Nobody asked. Tanner studied her for a second. Then he lowered his voice. "I've seen this fault before. It doesn't show in static runs, and the R6 hides it just long enough to fail under pressure." She met his eyes now. "Then you know what happens next?" "Yeah," he said, "I do." Miles watched them both, barely breathing. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew what it looked like. A tech who had been laughed out of a bay was now speaking directly to a Pentagon investigator, and neither of them sounded uncertain. Tanner stepped back. "Why are you here?" Keira returned to her work. "Because nobody reads the old files." Lance tried to cut in. "We've got it under control, sir. She's not even cleared for—" Tanner raised a hand. "Save it. I know what I'm looking at." Jonas cleared his throat. "Sir, with all respect, we're addressing the drift. It's not a mechanical issue. It's localized atmospheric distortion." Tanner didn't even blink. The vehicle's torque response fails at incline angles above 100.0 degrees per second. That's not weather. That's a system failing exactly as predicted in the original design documents. He turned back to Keira. "You wrote those, didn't you?" Keira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Tanner nodded once. He looked around the room, the way a man looks at a landscape before deciding where to dig. Then he left without another word. The hangar didn't breathe for a long time. Jonas stood motionless. Lance avoided eye contact. Ray hadn't even returned yet, but the air was already heavier, the walls closer, the silence louder. Miles walked over slowly. "You okay?" he asked her. Keira looked at the napkin beside her, still marked from the night before. "Not yet," she said, "but close." The bay door slammed shut behind Jonas, the sound echoing too loud in the empty garage. He stood just inside, clipboard limp in one hand, sweat bleeding through the collar of his shirt. Keira didn't move from the workbench. She had known he would come. Just not when... His footsteps scraped across the concrete as he stopped a few feet from her station. "They're going to ground the unit," he said, voice tight. "If that Bradley fails this next test, Ray's team won't move. And if that happens, Command is going to pull the readiness rating, and I'm going to have to answer for that." Keira waited. He wasn't done. "I need you to fix it," he continued. Softer now. Quietly. "You can install whatever mod you think will work. Just let me file it under my clearance. Make it look like we caught it in time." She met his eyes. "You want me to solve the failure, but not show that I was ever part of the solution." Jonas gave a weak shrug. "It's not personal. It's optics. Your name complicates things right now. Let me handle the paperwork, and we keep this place running." Kira's hands were already resting on the edge of the bench. She didn't raise her voice. "It goes in my way, or not at all." Jonas looked at her like someone trying to hold a conversation with a locked door. Then he ran a hand down his face and muttered something under his breath before turning and leaving the way he came. He didn't slam the door this time. Within the hour, the Bradley was parked in the far bay, angled beneath the high lights. The gantry arms had been raised, wheels chalked, and the rear panels unlatched for access. Keira worked without commentary. She pulled her torque meter from the case, calibrated it by touch. The override module fit snugly into the bracket she had fabricated the night before. No one asked what it was. She didn't explain. Her fingers moved with precision, not haste. Each bolt was tightened in sequence, every valve aligned to match the lateral load parameters she had memorized years ago. The sink line was last. When she closed the housing and stepped back, she didn't announce it. She just wiped her hands clean. Ray appeared as they rolled the Bradley into position for the final test. He looked from the vehicle to Jonas, then to Keira. "You let her install a homebrew mod on my transport," he snapped. "Are you trying to get us flagged?" Tanner stepped into view, tablet in hand, expression unreadable. She didn't jury-rig a fix. She designed the original system. Ray stared at him. "That's a bold claim." "It's a true one," Tanner replied. "And unless you want to explain to your superiors why you rejected a stable solution for a faulty patch, I'd let the test run speak." Ray didn't answer. He looked at the Bradley like it had just grown a second turret. The mechanics gathered along the side rail as the engine kicked on. Miles stood next to Lance, both men silent. No one laughed now. The hangar quieted as the vehicle inched forward, then accelerated down the short incline toward the test slope. The engine held firm. The tread caught gravel. The incline began. The lateral drift that had plagued it for days was gone. The vehicle climbed without hesitation, turned on the second curve with no rear deviation. The on-screen diagnostic line, usually bouncing in erratic spikes, now smoothed into a gentle wave, consistent, reliable. Keira watched it happen without moving. Her arms were crossed, eyes fixed on the line chart. She didn't need to see the machine to know it was responding exactly as it should. When the Bradley looped back and stopped, the bay filled with the sound of idling engines and held breath. Tanner looked at the monitor, then at Ray. "That wasn't luck," he said calmly. "She didn't guess that fix. She built the system." Ray said nothing. His jaw moved slightly, like he was chewing down the words that wanted out. He turned and walked away. Jonas stayed where he was. He didn't meet Kira's eyes, didn't speak, just watched the monitor a little too long before stepping back behind the clipboard he had never stopped holding. The mechanics along the wall began to scatter. Not fast, not in a rush, but in the quiet way people move when they're rethinking everything they thought they knew. Keira didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply reached for her wrench, returned it to the tray, and turned back to the corner of the bay where her bench sat waiting. Tanner remained a moment longer, watching the Bradley cool down. Then he glanced toward her. "We'll talk soon," he said. She gave a nod. That was all. The engine whirred down. The slope stood quiet. And for the first time in a long while, no one questioned the result. The fix didn't need an explanation. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. So had she. By the next morning, the Bradley sat on the main lift like a monument. It was clean, balanced, and quiet. Its systems idling in perfect sync. The hum it gave off was different now, tighter, steadier. Mechanics who had passed it 100 times without notice now slowed down. Eyes lingering just a little longer. They weren't gawking. They were listening. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. People who had once barely acknowledged Keira now seemed to orbit her without making eye contact. Conversations paused when she walked by. A few techs nodded, uncertain whether the gesture was respect or habit. Miles kept working at her bench without speaking unless she did first. Lance, for once, had nothing to say. Jonas held a clipboard again, but he stood taller now, voice louder when officers passed through the hangar. He led one of the morning tours with 2 base captains from Logistics Command. As they passed the Bradley, he gestured toward it like he was presenting a prototype at a trade show. "We've had some real success here," he said, tapping the display screen. "Collaborative innovation at the shop floor level. Great example of what our tech teams can do when given room to respond in the field." He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. She was standing 10 feet away, sorting parts in a plastic bin, wrench tucked behind her belt loop. The captains nodded, impressed. One of them took a picture of the torque diagram on the console. Later, Tanner made his way over with his usual slow, even gait. He didn't make announcements. He just spoke. The override mod has been approved for Phase 1 testing. He said, pilot upgrade. 4 facilities. Your blueprint is the template. Keira didn't smile. They'll want revisions. They always do, Tanner replied, but it's still yours. She looked back at the Bradley. They'll try to repackage it. They'll try, Tanner said, but the Pentagon is listing it under its original design signature. That signature has your name. Keira said nothing. She returned to her bench and picked up a socket driver. In the early afternoon, Ray walked in. No entourage this time. No sharp boots or clipped steps. He moved with the discomfort of a man who knew the room had shifted beneath him. He stood at the edge of her workspace, hands in his pockets, then finally set a small cup of coffee on the metal bench beside her. It wasn't hot. It had come from the vending machine outside, black, no sugar. She looked at it, then at him. I don't apologize much, Ray said, voice flat. So this isn't one of those. Keira picked up a bolt and kept working. But the next time we run field drills, he added, I want your kid on board. She didn't respond. He nodded once and left. The coffee sat on the bench for a while, cooling. Miles eventually walked by, gave it a glance, and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The rest of the week moved like the tide had turned. Keira remained in her station, still doing the same work, still taking apart components one layer at a time, but the air around her had changed. People waited for her to finish speaking before they moved on. Nobody called her girl or asked who let her near the tools. One afternoon, a memo came down from her former employer, an engineering firm in Virginia she hadn't heard from since the lawsuit. They had seen her name attached to the override blueprint. The message offered a meeting, a chance to return to the industry under renewed terms. Keira deleted it without replying. Tanner, hearing about the offer, raised the topic a few days later. They'll make it sound generous, but it's not about the work. It's about control. I know, Keira said. I've seen that game. You're not going to play it again. No, she replied. I'd rather build something that doesn't need me to lose myself to exist. The Bradley rolled back onto the course at the end of the week, running calibration under new field parameters. The system held, even under additional weight. The drift hadn't returned. The data lines on the display held steady curves. Nothing erratic. Nothing hidden. Tanner pointed to the readings in one of the briefings and said, This is the shape of balance. Back in the bay, someone returned a wrench to her bench. It wasn't labeled, but it had been cleaned. She turned it once in her hand before placing it back in the drawer. Justice didn't come loudly. It didn't announce itself with fanfare or applause. It arrived in the way people stood a little straighter when they walked past her, in the way Ray left the coffee without asking anything in return, in the way Jonas pretended not to see her when he took credit, but never corrected her presence again. She didn't walk taller. The ground simply stopped shifting underneath her. No one asked for her notes before. Now they wanted her insight on everything from balance sync to diagnostic bypasses, but she answered only when it mattered, not to impress, not to lecture, just to make things work. The results had spoken. She didn't need to. 3 months later, the garage no longer sounded like stress. The clatter of tools, the soft rumble of engines cycling through diagnostics, even the hiss of compressed air from the tire station, it all blended into something steady, almost peaceful. The noise had shape now, rhythm, purpose. The instruction bay wasn't large, but it had been cleared and repurposed with care. 2 workbenches stood side by side beneath a mounted torque wall. Across from them, a control console displayed overlay diagnostics in muted green, each curve looping clean and even. Above the bench hung a paper diagram, laminated and pinned with tape corners. It showed a torque curve sequence from a prototype suspension rig. The annotations were faded but still legible, drawn in her father's hand. Just beneath it, smaller and recent, were Keira's initials, written in neat, black ink. She stood beside the bench, watching Miles teach a recruit how to adjust for torque variance at incline. He spoke clearly, more confident now than he had ever been when she first met him. He no longer hesitated between terms or apologized before explaining something. He had learned the value of taking his time. He passed that lesson along now. Not with authority, but with clarity. "Don't force the thread," he told the new trainee. "Feel it. The torque meter tells you numbers, but the socket will tell you everything else if you listen." Keira didn't interrupt. She rarely did. Her presence alone guided more than any correction ever could. Across the bay, Lance stood leaning against a rolling cart, arms crossed. He didn't make jokes anymore. He didn't linger near the command stations or posture near visiting officers. He watched instead, not with resentment, but with something closer to curiosity. He hadn't asked for instruction yet, but he stayed close. Sometimes that was the first sign. The newest arrival came in just after lunch, a woman maybe 20, maybe younger, shoulders hunched beneath a coverall still too clean. She held her badge too tightly, kept glancing at the floor as if expecting to be told she was in the wrong place. Keira stepped away from the bench and met her halfway. "Name?" she asked. The recruit swallowed. "Jamie." Keira nodded once. "You here to learn?" Jamie gave a nervous nod. "Good," Keira said. "Pick a bench. We start with layout, not manuals. Hands." She handed Jamie a torque spanner, not the heavy one, but a mid-grade balanced tool with a grip polished smooth from years of use. Jamie took it like it might break. "You'll be fine," Keira said. "The machine won't fight you if you listen first." Jamie looked surprised. Then, slowly, she nodded again. At the far wall, 4 new M2 Bradleys stood in a line, freshly delivered from the factory. The serial plates were still crisp, their tread pads showing no wear. Each one had a small engraved plate welded beneath the rear panel, just above the sink housing. It read Torque, Stability, Override, Series 1. Beneath the title, just a name. No rank, no titles. Just a name. Keira had touched the panel on the first one when it arrived, not out of pride, out of recognition. Miles walked over between rotations and handed her a sheet of handwritten diagnostics. "Number 3's incline performance is solid," he said. "No flutter. We're not even pulling more than 0.4 variance on simulated terrain." "Good," Keira said. "You run the next test with Jamie." He blinked. "Me." "You're ready." Miles didn't argue. He just looked over his shoulder toward the new trainee, then nodded and stepped away to begin the setup. In the quiet moment that followed, Keira leaned on the edge of the bench and looked around the bay. The room was busy, but no one rushed. Instructions were given at full volume, but no one barked them. People moved like they belonged. She glanced up at the torque diagram on the wall. The smudges on the edge were hers. The calculations in the margins were her father's. The initials at the bottom were hers now. Not a signature, just a mark of continuity. A wrench clattered across the floor as Jamie fumbled with her grip. Miles caught it before it reached the wheel well and handed it back without comment. Jamie looked embarrassed, but Keira said nothing. Mistakes were part of the learning. What mattered was how people were treated after they made them. Lance watched the exchange from across the room. He didn't speak. But this time, he didn't look away. Keira turned back to her bench, opened the drawer, and replaced a tool she hadn't used in days. The factory override had taken its place. Her hands weren't idle, though. They moved with quiet precision, sorting, adjusting, checking that every piece was where it needed to be. Not because she needed control, but because order made space for others to grow. She didn't need credit. She didn't need a nameplate or a title or a podium. What she had now was something better. She had a place where people could show up awkward, unsure, unseen, and find their footing. A place where knowledge passed hand to hand, not top down. Where the machine got better because the people around it did too. Legacy wasn't something you waited to be given. It was something you left in the hands of others, in their steadiness, in their questions, in their mistakes, and in their victories. The wrench in Jamie's grip turned slowly, then steadied. Keira smiled, just barely, then turned back to work. Keira was never after recognition. She didn't need a stage or applause. What she wanted was something deeper to do, work that mattered, to protect what she built, and to lift others quietly along the way. In a place that once dismissed her, she became the foundation others now learn from. Not through titles or speeches, but through steady hands, clear knowledge, and the courage to keep showing up. Her story is a reminder that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it works in silence, shaping everything around it. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, remember this. Your worth isn't defined by who notices you. It's revealed by what you build when no one's watching. Let us know what part of Keira's journey stayed with you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and follow for more stories where quiet strength changes everything.